Welcome to the analysis of the effect of demographic pressures, economic decline, and human rights violations on human movement. This study will analyze aggregate data from the failed states 2013 dataset and through indexing, correlation, and regression analysis help answer the question of which social, economic, and political military factors help us predict which states have high instances of human movement. This question is important because, according to Jeremy Stein, the international refugee regime system is a network of international importance. There have been recent debates around refugees from failing states, debates centering around questions such as, why are there refugees? This question is important because it helps analysts differentiate between stable states and non-stable states and pinpoint the weaknesses of those states that force their nationals to become refugees or IDPs. As Robert Chambers mentions in his article, developmental programs do a disservice if they neglect the adverse effects of refugee on host countries. This question has huge implications for policymaking in developmental initiatives by intergovernmental organizations. Being one of the most important concerns of our day and age, the results of this research study have broad applications and are gateways for future research for states to. For my dependent variable, I have created an index which operationalizes the concept of state stability as sustained patterns of human movement. I created this index using three separate variables from failed states 2013 that indicate different types of human movement: human flight, refugees/IDPs, and national groups. The three together have a combined alpha score of 0.683, which is more than the threshold of 0.60, which tells us that the indicators are measuring the same concept and are appropriate for this index. I have recoded my index human move into three categories. Missing cases were not required as it was aggregate data collection. The three categories are most stable, which would be countries with the least human movement, stable, which would be countries with average human movement, and least stable countries with the most human movement. The measures of central tendency tells us that most of the cases fall around the mode and medium of 2.0. This is accurately reflected in the table as 54.8% of valid cases were considered stable countries. My independent variables are the following. X1 is mounting demographic pressure coded as DemPress. My hypothesis is based on William B. Wood's article that tells us that socioeconomic and environmental conditions are enough for a population to flee. So, increased discrepancies between population density and sustenance increases population flight because the population can't stay where they cannot sustain themselves. Demographic pressure will positively influence human movement. X2 is sharp economic decline read as econ-dec. Huck and Bouvier tell us that when populations are unable to find themselves employment, shelter, or food because of the state's decreased ability to meet financial obligation, this creates pressure for citizens to move. Economic decline will positively influence human movement. Human rights is X3, read as hum-r. Huck and Bouvier tell us that the abuse of basic human rights will force populations into the fear that failure to migrate will result in destructive consequences for the potential refugee. Human rights violations will positively influence human movement. The independent variables have been recoded to have three categories that go in the order of most M of the indicator to least L of the indicator. The next step in the study was to create a correlation matrix to calculate the Pearson's R of each variable to see the strength of their relationship and the direction. The table tells us that each of the relationships is positive and not inverse. The scores of Pearson's R ranged from 0.50 to 8.80, which meant that relationships between variables were either fairly strong or strong. In terms of human move, our dependent variable, it has the strongest Pearson R value with hum-r. When squaring Pearson's R, we find that human rights also explains 4.3% of the variation in the human movement index, whereas demographic pressure and economic decline explain 3.5 and 3.0%. Going further, we create a multiple regression table. To avoid multicollinearity, I've created a dummy variable for economic decline, which isolates most economic decline as its reference group. Consistent with the correlation matrix, human move seems to be explained expressed by the HUM-R indicator with a B value of 0.424 and a beta value of 0.451, the highest of the table. Controlling for demographic pressure and economic decline, a change in 1 unit of human movement, there is a change in the same direction of 0.4 of a unit for human rights. Demographic pressures produced a relatively insignificant correlation with human movement. For economic decline, we see that countries with the least economic decline have 0.3 of a unit less human movement than countries with the most economic decline, and countries with some economic decline seem to have less than 1/10 of a unit more human movement than countries with the most economic decline. This seems counterintuitive, but countries with the least or only some economic decline both have relatively statistically insignificant results anyways. The results lead us to believe that economic decline is not a good indicator. Independent analysis with cross-tabulations between economic decline and human movement index support these results. The tolerance score for each variable is higher than 0.20 and is therefore unlikely that they're measuring the same concept. From the R2 and adjusted R² value, we see that about 48% of the variance in the index human movement can be explained by this model. Our results are that demographic pressure is not a reliable indicator of human movement, inconsistent with the academic literature, but explained by the fact that demographic pressures are contextual to geography and environment. We reject hypothesis 1. Further research would have differentiation between regions and demographic pressures, which would be a better indication of which pressures will affect human movement predictably enough to be statistically significant. Economic decline is also statistically insignificant and is the weakest variable in the study. We reject hypothesis 2. This is contrary to academic literature, but decline is temporal and can have factors that might not have bearing on state failure or stability. Human rights violations turns out to be the strongest indicator of human movement, explaining 4.5% of the variation in the human movement index, more than X1 and X2, and also is statistically significant enough that we can rely on its predictability. We accept hypothesis 3, that as there is an increase in human rights violations, there's also an increase in human movement, which means that there's a decrease in state stability. This is consistent with the academic literature because human rights are not contextual, they are by definition universal. Other variables can be affected by several factors that the state might not be able to readily control, such as natural disasters, but violating human rights is always a result of state instability. Sample size of 177 tells us that the results are generalizable to the international state population. Further research must have a two-pronged approach. 1. Amend human rights violations to decrease human movement out of fear of persecution, and 2. To prevent host countries from becoming saturated because of the human movement problem.